District of Conservation is sponsored by the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow, better known as CFACT. To learn more about our sponsor, head over to cfact.org. Thanks for listening to the program.
The new LinkedIn Hiring Pro can't undo your last hire. The human postponer. They were the master of one phrase. I'll circle back on that. But 3 months later, you were the one doing all their work and wondering how big that circle is. But LinkedIn Hiring Pro can take the hiring load off your plate by automating the hiring busy work from the initial job post to scheduling interviews. Hire right the first time with LinkedIn Hiring Pro. Post a free job today at linkedin.com/quality.
Welcome to District of Conservation. I am your host, Gabriella Hoffman. This podcast offers a sober examination into all things hunting, fishing, shooting sports, energy, environment, and the public policy surrounding it. And this podcast also specializes in original interviews that you won't hear elsewhere. Here's what I have for you today. Happy 6-year anniversary to the Great American Outdoors Act for becoming law. It is one of the most signature, seminal conservation pieces in the last half century, passed 6 years ago on this day by President Trump in the first administration. It does a lot to help the deferred maintenance backlog, helping to replenish parks, keep Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is funded by offshore oil and gas royalties, in perpetuity. There is an effort to reauthorize it going on in Congress. Professionally, I support it for Independent Women's Center for Energy and Conservation, and it's a very easy thing to pass. Will Congress pass it? That remains to be seen. But figuring this is August 4th, when the law originally was signed, why not reemphasize that? If you want to learn more information about reauthorization, what the GAOA doesn't do, you can find out in the show notes. I'll include that for your listening pleasure today. I also want to express my sorrow and condolences to those out west dealing with those high-intensity wildfires. The Old Trails wildfire that has broken out in Spokane, Washington. Unfortunately and sadly, it seems to be the doing of another arsonist. A lot of these fires out west, unfortunately, are started by individuals. Human ignition is one of the biggest factors behind why these wildfires spread, why they are devastating and horrible, especially in areas where it's susceptible with live fuels, no treatment, and the like. When you see coverage blaming climate change is actually a tertiary factor explaining why high-intensity wildfires are so intense. It's live fuels, it's the weather, and then it's climate change. And I can point to you that study where I derived this from. But before you hear people sensationalize wildfires in this manner, read the details, because this is the work of an arsonist and not climate change. Hopefully the people out there in Spokane, in that region, Tri-Cities area, I'm not sure if it's extended there, but it's Spokane, Washington, a little bit away from Tri-Cities, which I've visited, and we've done the hydro dam story from a couple years ago for Conservation Country. Hope they get some relief over there. On the theme of trying to expose alarmism is also my focus briefly today on this crazy peer-reviewed study that is out. I can't believe scientists are still arguing this, and by extension, environmentalists are arguing population bomb, population control, Malthusian arguments in order to advance this notion of sustainability or conservation, and why this is so out of left field and bizarre, and the fact that this is given attention and legitimacy in this major scientific paper. I saw some sensational headlines, you probably did too, in the last few days of this study arguing, the headline reads, I kid you not, achieve sustainability by easing population to 4 billion by 2200, when many of us listening and existing today, we're not going to be around to see. I'm sorry to laugh, but this is so preposterous, and they're crazy and insane, so it's not a laughing matter. So I want to calm myself, but I'm laughing because it's preposterous that this is published in a so-called scientific journal of record. It's peer-reviewed, and it's being treated seriously. It was published July 26, 2026, and it is by the Sustainable Development Early View. It's a research article circulated by Wiley Online Library. And who is the originator of this? I'm curious to see. This is going to be in Sustainable Development Magazine, and it's an online version record before inclusion in an issue. Reading more about this particular journal, Sustainable Development, it is edited by a Professor Richard Welford of the National Institute of Development Administration in Bangkok, Thailand. So they call themselves an interdisciplinary journal, which seeks to address and discuss ways to deliver sustainable development. Papers must address issues associated with the achievement of sustainable development of one or more of the sustainable development goals. From the UN, those 17 sustainable goals I've talked about before. We have a large readership, including policymakers in central and local governments and NGOs, decision makers in business, academics, researchers, scientists, and engineers. And more to what their thesis, rather their abstract, is. Let's read their abstract for you. The past century of massive increases in human population and resource use has seen many undesirable environmental effects, ranging from biodiversity loss to climate change. But a research gap exists, as the ultimate causes are often not described with precision or mentioned at all. In this study, metrics of biodiversity, consumption, and pollution show strong correlations when charted against human population size and its per capita impacts. We describe causal mechanisms for these correlations. Then, using available data, we show that slowing and gradually reversing population growth to 4 billion or less by 2200 while moderating per capita impacts is the path towards sustainability. Among the benefits are habitat recovery and conservation of wildlife species, reduced greenhouse gas emissions and other pollutants, reduced conflict over resources, and a reduction of global poverty. You read this, and I'm going to include this for you to peruse and read for yourself, but just that summary leads me to believe that these people live in an echo chamber and literally do not touch grass or go out in nature and interact with people and recognize the connection, the positive correlation between population growth and continued practice and conservation of the environment, that as you consume more resources, you can still have a maintenance of the environment, and actually the opposite effect occurs as you can continue to have continual human population growth and also economic growth. Those are often associated with a better quality of life. And when people have a better quality of life, you start to see actual caring for the environment. And you see with more private, let's say, conservation efforts, more forest growth. We see in general, more species are being discovered. Nobody likes to talk about it. We see and hear about new species being discovered. We see that species are recovering and being delisted here at home in the United States. We see that there is more greening happening around the world, even with more energy production. And I want to reassure you that despite the premise of this article, we're in a period of superabundance, not scarcity. And I want to remind listeners that Paul Ehrlich, who just passed away this year, was a big propagator of this thinking that if you shrink the population and consume fewer resources, you're going to have a better quality of life. But in the decades of his work, he was proven to be wrong. And I wrote an article on Earth Day with Sydney Rodman, who is one of my fellows at Independent Women. She works with me at our center. And we wrote a great piece about how his predictions came wrong. He was advocating for very bizarre policies to shrink the population while ignoring the fact that as we consume more resources, we, let's say, consume more energy, that you actually see a positive effect, that there's innovation, there's creativity, there's ways to mitigate, impact from this. So if you want to get kind of a primer on that and his wayward thinking and how he influenced millions of people to not have children negatively, and how a lot of people have expressed remorse and regret buying into his rhetoric, that you have to subscribe to this rewilding Malthusian interpretation of environmentalism, which is preservation, not conservation. And we sadly see this conflation of the two under the auspices of rewilding and preservation. They all go hand in hand. Climate alarmism goes hand in hand with this. And I'm not surprised to see this UN-affiliated paper, by all accounts, saying that they're in accordance with the 17 UN sustainable goals, which argues for a lot of the stuff: rewilding, population control, stopping to use fossil fuels, oil, coal, and gas, and even shrugging nuclear energy, But I have the article about Paul Ehrlich and his history and the damage he did to people culturally, how it was a net negative to conservation, environmentalism. But this type of environmentalism is fading into obsolescence. It's becoming extinct as more people recognize that human flourishing is not at odds with environmental progress and environmental conservation efforts. And I want to point you to, I mentioned just momentarily recently that we are super abundant. We have more resources, despite all the reports otherwise, or despite some of the sensational headlines you see. And I want to point you to Human Progress, which is a project of the Cato Institute. I think they do a great job assessing where we are in terms of natural resources. Can we handle more population growth? And they're absolutely correct, and their findings point to this. So in their most recent Simon Abundance Index for 2026, they found that the Earth was 536.4% more abundant compared to last year, abundant last year than it was in 1980. For every 1% increase in population, global resource abundance increased 6.31%. And I'm going to explain more what this is. What does this abundance index measure? It measures the relationship between abundance, resource, and population. It combines the per person abundance of 50 basic commodities with the size of the world's population into a single number. The index began in 1980 with a base value of 100. In 2025, it stood at 636.4, indicating that resources have become 536.4% more abundant over the last 45 years. All 50 commodities in the dataset were more abundant last year than they were in 1980. The global abundance of resources increased at a compound annual growth rate of 4.2%, thus doubling every 17 years. This originates from Julian Simon, the late University of Maryland economist and Cato Institute senior fellow who pioneered research and analysis between the relationship involving population growth and resource abundance. He argued famously that if resources were truly finite, as many people believe, an increase in population would be expected to lead to scarcity and higher prices. However, as Simon discovered through exhaustive research spanning decades, the opposite was true. As the global population increased, resources tended to become more abundant. How is this possible? Human progress poses. Julian Simon understood that atoms without knowledge have no economic value. It is knowledge that transforms atoms into resources that benefit all of us. While the quantity of atoms on Earth is finite, the frontiers of undiscovered knowledge are infinite. He also understood that human beings, especially those living under conditions of economic and political freedom, can create new knowledge. He wrote, quote, "The ultimate resource is people, especially skilled, spirited, and hopeful young people endowed with liberty, who exert their wills and imaginations for their own benefit, and so inevitably they will benefit the rest of us as well." Which is what I argue. I argue this energy abundance posture. I believe in abundance, generally speaking. I think it can also accommodate the notion that you could support public lands too. In that framework, while you're also supporting private conservation efforts, there's sometimes diverging views in abundance. Some people don't like public lands. I'm of that mindset that I think those go hand in hand with private, and full privatization efforts could be at a detriment. That's besides the point. But we have mostly private land in the United States. Of that which is publicly held by the federal government, I think is an adequate number. Any more, any less, I think would be not wise to pursue. I think what we have is fine. We need to manage it and ensure that we maintain and expand access. However, this notion of abundance, I think, is a great alternative to net zero thinking, which also encompasses this population control notion, this idea that we live in a very scarce world, that resources are scarce and not plentiful. But as I read out for you, we do see that. Yes, there's debate over water issues, electricity usage, and the like, as we're finding out with data centers. That is being currently debated. A lot of people are putting out information, perhaps unwise information or untrue information about how much water is consumed by data centers compared to, let's say, almond farmers or golf courses, and that is going to be sorted out and people will see what that really is. But with generally speaking, how resources are today, like I told you, and how we often talk about here at the show, that we continue to find new species. We continue to innovate as we produce more energy or to tap into, more resources. We try to find ways to innovate, mitigate our impact, and ensure that we don't leave our environment worse off. That's what people in prosperous first world countries do. America, bar none, does conservation the best of any country. And I'm biased being American in saying that, but we truly do. And we are innovative. When things involve the government and when government is stewarded properly with people who are competent and offer a business mindset, offer this true conservation mindset, we do see more things happen, more positive things happen. And when you have bad managers who believe in top-down approaches, they worsen conservation, they worsen the environment by punishing people who can innovate, who want to be partners in conservation when it involves public lands, for instance, or they go after private actors, even for areas that don't encompass public lands. They just want to regulate people in perpetuity, leave things held hostage. They want red tape, they want bureaucracy, and that's why you see this problem of very high-intensity wildfires out west, related and unrelated to this. But I think what we have to remember, a takeaway from this and from this study, is that this is like a dying view, thankfully. Like that's one thing I can surmise from this. The fact that they're publishing this and legitimizing these worldviews is crazy to me as more and more people move away from this thinking because they realize that humans are part of the landscape. Humans have to be part of conservation efforts. Human progress is not at odds with environmental progress, and those two often overlap and have positive qualities amongst them. And we don't have to trade economic security, economic prosperity for that of conservation. And environmentalism has thankfully moved away from this, but a lot of these people, climate alarmists including, still cling to this very 1970s thinking a la Paul Ehrlich and his ilk, that you need to reduce the population, you need to employ ridiculous population control policies, you shouldn't have any children, all those people who do doom and gloom about, oh, don't have kids, it's going to worsen the environment. But who are you going to pass down that legacy to? If you care about conservation, who are you going to pass that down to if you don't have kids and all? Like, shouldn't you want to pass down your conservation work to the future? Like, God willing, if I get married, have kids one day, I want to pass down that legacy onto them. I have nieces and nephews that I can help influence, but I have lots of friends who have kids who are married and they believe in conservation. They hope to pass down that. So how can you hold that view of supporting having the population? You're going to have economic inequality, insecurity. It's going to be disastrous. So you, like I said, with this human progress index, abundance index, they show that positive correlation between population growth and resource abundance. I think that's very helpful to inject there into the conversation to counter this crazy study. Again, peer-reviewed, soon to be published study that legitimizes this view. And you could read beyond the abstract for your knowledge and for your interest if you are curious. But this is a diminishing, worldview, thankfully, from what I see. But you still have to combat it. You still have to expose how ludicrous it is and how crazy it is, just to showcase that, yeah, actually, you can have a middle ground. I don't think people are for overdevelopment. It's a minority position. But you have these rewilders, preservationists, alarmists who say, you, the person, are bad. Like, these people think humans are inherently bad. We're the worst thing on the landscape. We destroy everything. If you held that attitude, you don't belong in conservation. Let's point blank say that. I think those people are antagonistic. They undermine progress. They undermine environmental stewardship, and they should be dismissed and not listened to. They're not paragons of authority. They are a diminishing influence, thankfully, in this space, in conservation writ large. But there's still, some people still cling to that worldview because they can profit, they can sensationalize, they can get clicks, they can generate this. So I think this study in the long run is going to be dismissed. It should be dismissed, but people will refer to it and say, see, a peer-reviewed study says this, we still have to do this. And the fact that they're so brazen about it, it's very similar to other studies that have come out. Like last year, I don't remember if I talked about it on the show. Listeners can refresh our memory. I don't think we did. But there was a study that said that we can curb meat consumption by helping to, let's say, or use a little bit of those Lone Star ticks that make you allergic to meat to fight climate change. And when I read that, I thought that was out of The Onion or some satirical paper. No, it was another, again, peer-reviewed study that legitimizes viewpoint that it's okay to have the Lone Star tick and develop chronic issues from getting bitten if you happen to get bitten because we need people to consume less meat. It's ridiculous that is argued, but it's similar of this vein. I think it's similar to this Malthusian argument that is made here to claim that things will be sustainable if we have the population. That's crazy to me. Maybe I am too, old school when it comes to this kind of thing, and maybe my viewpoint is in the minority. I don't think I'm in the minority in thinking this, and I hope you get reassurance and know that this is not a majority held opinion. I think this is a declining worldview in environmentalism, and it's just clinging to its last breaths. And they think that publishing peer-reviewed study is going to help keep those ideas afloat. I think it's going to the wayside, but read that for yourself. I am not kidding when this abstract is out there. It's quite entertaining if you want to read more into this, but that is what we are still up against in the conservation space, in the true conservation space. Have kids, teach them, pass down conservation practices like hunting, fishing, and the like, respect for the environment. Teach them that you can do things on public lands and private lands that even individuals and private enterprise actually can correct a lot of environmental issues better than the government sometimes, depending on who you have as managers in these critical positions. and that we can have a harmonious relationship between nature and people and see that progress. So I think we will win in the long run. This is a diminishing view. This is a minority view, but it needs to be exposed. And we're happy to shed light on it here on the show. Let me know what you think. If you enjoyed this installment of District of Conservation, I would love to know your feedback. Send it my way. Please be sure to leave us reviews on Apple, Spotify, or wherever podcasts are played. And also check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter to never miss a beat nor a guest announcement. Thanks so much for listening to District of Conservation. I hope you have a wonderful day. And please share the podcast to those who may be interested in learning more about these critical natural resources, environment, energy issues.